I guess you could say that today's show has a gimmick to it, in the sense that Carl Zimmer and Ben Zimmer, who are brothers, are going to be guests in different segments about completely different topics. They're both very well-known writers and thinkers and journalists, and they're not talking about the same thing at all. And they'd be great guests. Well, I mean, each of them has been on this show, multiple times before, and they're guests that we would be happy to have in any context. Carl has written a book kind of about the definition of life and whether there can ever be one. And Ben right now is interested in an artificial intelligence that seems to be able to beat really good humans at crossword puzzle filling in, if that's the right term. Anyway, the Zimmer brothers after this. All right, welcome to the show. This is maybe this is only of interest to us. I don't really know. By us, I mean probably me and Jonathan McPants and maybe Kat Pastor. But I don't think we've ever done anything quite like this before. I mean, we've had people on, I think, who are related to one another, usually on together. The idea of having the two Zimmer brothers, Carl and Ben, on the show completely separately. I don't know. It just appealed to us somehow. And we're not going to be going into their family dynamics or anything like that. There's articles you can read if you want to read about that. Although there's one thing I did want to mention, and that is that, growing up, they had very, very busy parents. And so Carl and Ben Zimmer, who both went on to become very, very famous writers, journalists, thinkers, and who are going to be here today to talk, in one case, about Carl's book, which is called Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. A little small question, really. Ben Zimmer will be joining us later. He's famously a columnist on language and linguistics for the Wall Street Journal. He's going to actually be talking about artificial intelligence and an AI that can actually beat human beings at filling in crossword puzzles. But when they were growing up, they had very, very busy parents, and their Uncle Don really kind of stepped forward and, really provided, I think, kind of a guiding hand to both of the young boys. And it unfortunately kind of ended on kind of a melancholy note. So here's Don Zimmer talking about that.
Going into the third year, I kind of got a feeling that I wasn't needed anymore, which was all right with me, but it kind of wore on me a little bit. To where I went home one night and I told my wife, I said, I'm quitting, we're going home. She said, I don't think that's the way to go. She said, you want to go home? We'll go home. Just tell them you're retiring. It sounds better. And I listened to her.
All right. It's sad even when I hear it now. And I hate to be airing some family laundry of the Zimmers, but okay, I should just, that's Don Zimmer. That's actually Don Zimmer talking about ending his time as the bench coach under Don Baylor of the Colorado Rockies. There's a memo we get every week to saying, please stop saying things on the air that are not true. Apparently there's some NPR policy about it. It's very small-minded, but all right. Joining us now, the first of two Zimmers, or mini Zimmers. We're going to play some Hans Zimmer. We are going to play some Hans Zimmer scores later. Carl Zimmer is a science columnist for the New York Times. His newest book is Life's Edge: The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Welcome back to our show, Carl Zimmer.
Good to be here.
So, one of the really kind of fascinating things about all this is, and near the end of the book, you do a thing where you kind of review all the things that we know in the 21st century. The fact that we could, for example, not you and I, but humankind could almost instantly sequence the genome of a brand new pandemic virus, and put it in a shared database, and then develop vaccines pretty quickly from that. It's an indication of our incredible level of biomedical sophistication. But we don't really have a definition for something as basic as the idea of life, right? There isn't a commonly held definition for what it means to be alive.
Yeah, there are definitions, but there are just too many of them. There are literally hundreds of definitions of life that have been published in the scientific literature, and there are more that keep coming out. So there's no convergence towards a simple, straightforward definition of life, which, as a science writer, I just find astonishing. I mean, imagine that chemists just didn't agree exactly on what a molecule is. It's a strange state of affairs, but I think it tells us something deep about life itself.
So I'm going to sort of counterintuitively kind of go to the end of the book for the beginning of the conversation, just to show people how weird this can get. To me, one of the weirder moments, this is a really fascinating book, by the way, and it's just loaded with storytelling, historical storytelling, and you'll learn all kinds of things about maple trees and snakes, and we don't have time for all of that today, and that's why you have to get Carl's book, obviously. But towards the end, one of the weirder stories involves a guy named Lee Cronin. And here's the Papulian through line to Ben. It's Lee Cronin with essentially a robot that, well, you pick up the story. This is a robot that makes kind of a facsimile of life with, very little to go on to do it.
Yeah, that's right. So Lee Cronin is a chemist at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and he wants to address the question of how life began. And, the general idea is like, well, whatever life is, it started through some kind of chemistry. And people have been trying to sort of say like, okay, well, how do we get to our proteins and our DNA and so on? So they're actually trying to think of like, how do we get to life as we know it? And Lee just says, well, maybe like lots of different kind of chemicals can produce things that we might call alive. So I'm just going to build a robot that's just going to grind through like countless combinations of very simple molecules and see what happens. And what's happening is that he is getting these fascinating, weird droplets that they kind of look alive. They race around in their dishes like cats. They will split apart as if they are reproducing. They do all sorts of lifelike things, and these are so simple. Like they typically contain 4 or 5 very basic chemicals just mixed together. And so that might tell us something deeper about life than the kind of life that we know here on Earth.
Right, and they I think getting little formations together and do things. It's very eerie. So I'm going to ask you to kind of basically defy the premise of your book and say, okay, so these things are not really alive, because blank.
Well, they can split apart, but they don't sort of split apart in a sort of reliable way. They don't have sort of any kind of genetic information that they could pass down, and it would differentiate one group of droplets from another. But we're in the borderlands here. Like there are things about them that certainly would qualify them as alive. But we deal with that all the time with things like viruses and so on. We're surrounded by things that check some of the boxes that we think are essential for life, but leave other boxes blank.
Right. So in a way, we have in that moment 2 different very interesting strands in your book. One of them is, as you say, and we'll come back to this in just a couple of seconds, this whole idea of borderline things, things that are not exact. And viruses, I think, are the most prevalent example. But there's also in that this sort of ongoing question of, well, could you create something? Could a human intelligence or a robot create something that would be alive? And of course, we can go all the way back to Romantic poets and to Mary Shelley, and pretty quickly we get to this.
Dr. Baumann, I learned a great deal from you at the university about the violet ray, the ultraviolet ray, which you said was the highest color in the spectrum. You were wrong. Here in this machinery, I have gone beyond that. I have discovered the great ray that first brought life into the world.
Oh, and your proof?
Tonight you shall have your proof. At first I experimented only with dead animals, and then a human heart which I kept beating for 3 weeks. But now I'm going to turn that ray on that body and endow it with life.
And you really believe that you can bring life to the dead?
That body is not dead. It has never lived.
So the story of Frankenstein doesn't grow up out of nothing. It grows out of a kind of a parallel scientific conversation that was being had at that moment, and many, many moments preceding it. There's a way in which Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, feeds into this. Maybe you could just say a little bit about this whole, because it really also gets into that question, that what is life question. Is life a force that you could somehow or other activate and put into something?
Yeah, so you can actually find scholars asking what is life pretty early on in the history of modern Western science, and I think one of the reasons for that was that in the 1600s, people like Galileo, people like Newton were recasting the natural world as being sort of passive matter in motion, subject to these different physical forces. And so then some people said, well, maybe we ourselves and our bodies are also just matter in motion, and maybe life is just a certain kind of physics. And there were others who said, whoa, hold on. There's something really different between something that's alive and something that isn't. And they would sometimes talk about this as terms of a vital force, that their life was imbued with a vital force. And so then the question is, well, what's that vital force? What produces it? And, Mary Shelley very, brilliantly sort of like captures the weird kind of horror of thinking about whether scientists might try to actually control that force if it existed and be able to use it to bring the dead back to life. And in a way, like that still kind of dominates our thinking today. That's why Frankenstein still resonates for us today.
I love the little detail that one of the people kind of trafficking a little kind of late-ish in the game, too, in this notion of the life force, or in his case, élan vital, was Henri Bergson, who came to America to lecture about this, and you say, may have caused the first traffic jam in New York City, because people were so excited about this kind of science philosopher.
Yeah, well, I mean, and in a way, like people like Bergson in the early 1900s were kind of giving people sort of a hope that, life was not, quote unquote, just chemistry. There was something a bit depressing about, the new science of biochemistry. It was like, oh, is that it? Is that all we are? It's just a series of chemical reactions? And so someone like Bergson would be like, no, like there is more to life than that. And people ate it up and caused traffic jams to hear him talk.
So, I mean, in fact, though, there are still pressing needs to figure out how we're going to define life, how we're going to kind of create a bar that it has to cross to be life. And one of the groups that has to do that is NASA, because if they find blueberries on Mars, which, parentheses, they did, but not real blueberries, if you find stuff, then you've got to say, well, is this thing alive? So they came up with life as a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution, which seems to me like it would really be very disappointing to the Henri Bergson fans. But it also feels, I don't know, there's something very insufficient about that. I feel almost like the Darwinian evolution part of it almost begs the question, that life is something that acts like it's alive.
Well, and that's the challenge, which is that when you're trying to define something like life, you sort of end up saying like, well, life is this thing that is like life, or life is something that has all the qualities of life, and somehow that's disappointing. And I think part of it is that it may be like approaching life the wrong way. Instead of trying to define it, we should be waiting for scientists to really develop a theory of life, which we really don't have yet.
Yeah, and I think the definitions also, the problem with the definitions is they're not as interesting. I mean, you can have a true definition that still doesn't really feel interesting or useful. I mean, one of the other ones you cite is a Russian-born geneticist, Edward Trifonov, who says he gets it down to self-reproduction with variations. Well, it'd be kind of hard to argue against that definition, but you just sort of wonder, how interesting that definition is. And maybe the best way to do this is to get into an example. We talked about viruses before. We spent the last 12 to 18 months talking about viruses in this country, people who never thought about viruses in their lives and think they know a lot about them. But there's like this ongoing, not entirely resolvable thing. Is a virus alive or not? Explain why that's even a question.
Well, so viruses, they do a lot of the things that we think are incredibly distinctive for being alive. And so you mentioned, Darwinian evolution. We have seen, the coronavirus just displaying Darwinian evolution in spades. And it's just, these variants are continuing to adapt to us and make our lives difficult. So yeah, viruses can definitely evolve. However, they are not self-sustaining. They don't have a virus doesn't go out and eat something and then just be able to, keep its own metabolism running and have its own homeostasis. It's just a package of genes that it pushes into a cell. That's it. So, one scientist who helped come up with the NASA definition of life was asked, well, what about viruses? And he said, oh yeah, they don't make the cut. But I find that weirdly fascinating because here's something that affects life so much that we're just going to say is, well, not quite alive.
Right. And it's also very interesting because if you listen to virologists and microbiologists talk about viruses, they talk about them as kind of having what a philosopher would call an interest, right? I mean, a virus has an interest in invading a cell and finding another host. Certainly the people who study viruses, the viruses seem as though, they have a purpose. And I realize that's not anywhere in the NASA definition or a lot of these definitions, but it's hard to watch them and understand what they do without thinking, well, this is a thing that is trying to keep going. Which I guess is different from self-sustaining.
Well, but that is actually something that people would talk about, centuries ago when they were trying to figure out what the difference was between life and non-life. And so they would say, well, okay, fine, the moon goes around the Earth thanks to Newton's laws of motion, and that's that, and that's enough to explain it. But, a living thing, whether it's a bacterium or a rabbit, it develops things that have a purpose, so a rabbit's ears are for hearing so that it can hear its predators and get away. And rabbits behave in certain ways that enable them to stay alive and to reproduce. So there is a purposefulness in living things. It's a purpose that's brought about through evolution. But you just don't find that in the natural world. A mountain isn't, doing something because for some ultimate goal. It's just a mountain.
So there's also the really interesting argument that, when we think of life, another thing we think about, we start talking about cells pretty quickly. And a virus isn't really a cell, but it can take over a cell. It can grab the steering wheel of a cell and start driving it in its own quote unquote chosen direction. So one argument is, well, at that point, they're probably alive.
Yeah. So there's a French scientist named Patrick Forterre who has tried to find a middle ground in the big debate about whether viruses are alive or not. And it is a debate that's gone on for decades, actually. And so what Patrick Forterre says is when a virus is just floating around on its own, at a stage that scientists will call a virion, a virion is not alive. But when it goes into a cell, that cell is completely reconfigured. That cell infected with a virus is no longer like the cells around it. When people get COVID infections, you can actually, if you take an infected cell out of someone's airway and look at it under a microscope, you can see it's different. The virus basically coaxes it to create all sorts of little sort of incubators for producing new viruses inside of it. That cell has a new goal. It has a new purpose to make new viruses. And so Patrick Forterre argues that this virocell, as he calls it, is its own form of life. It's a fascinating way to think about it.
Of course, it doesn't know that it has that goal. And that's another part of this, right? Although, lots of things that are alive don't know that they're alive and don't really know what their goals are. Although, there is an interesting section of your book very early on in the book where you talk about what are called organoids and a question about whether they could become conscious. I don't know, maybe you can just quickly sketch that out for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing that's out on that weird borderland of life and non-life, and it's particularly important because it's arguably human life. So scientists have been able to figure out how to reprogram our cells with different chemicals, and it turns out to be not as hard as people had thought initially. So basically, I could take a little skin sample from your hand, and I could put those cells in a dish, and with the right combination of chemicals, I could reprogram it so that it would turn into the kind of a neuron that you would find in an embryo. And that would start to grow and divide into a brain-like structure. 1 million neurons, all organized in ways that are very similar to the human brain in terms of how the layers form and so on. And so scientists call these things brain organoids. And if you give them the right food, these cells will sustain themselves. So they are alive. They are human cells. They're from you. And not only that, but they spontaneously start giving off electrical activity. They even start to organize into producing what look a lot like brain waves. So there are all sorts of ways in which these things are not just looking like brains, but are behaving like brains. And so, if we think of, the human brain as like the key feature of human life, think about it. Like when people are brain dead, they're declared dead. Mm-hmm. So here we have this human brain organoid just totally on its own in a dish. What is it? Is it alive? Is it a human life? Do we accord it rights yet? I mean, no one's ever shown that a human brain organoid is conscious, but maybe we just haven't built a big enough one yet. So there are some big questions that we're going to have to reckon with in the years to come with these things.
I just feel like there's one listener out there right now who took mescaline right before the show and is really freaking out right now. And he's like calling 211 and saying, "No, Carl Zimmer's talking about this thing and it's really scaring me." But it's a very freaky concept. And speaking of freaky concepts, before we go to the break here, when we seem to have a very Gallic conversation going on here already, but we should throw this something that I had never heard of before, but this thing called Cotard's syndrome. Explain what that is.
So, in my book, I argue that part of the challenge with life, and one of the reasons we have this trouble with life, is that we think that the question, "What is life?" should have a simple answer. And I think we think it should be simple because we ourselves know that we are alive. I'm alive, you're alive, but you didn't come to that determination through science. You just know it. And the striking thing is that there are people who know that they are dead. This is called Cotard syndrome. It was named after Jules Cotard, who discovered this in 1874. And basically, he had a patient who said that she was dead. She had no brains, no nerves, no stomach. There's only skin and bones of a decomposing body. And she's telling Cotard this. And so it's a rare but, persistent condition, and it's very unsettling. And I think it speaks to how what we take as being obvious actually is really more a product of how our brains are wired. If you change the wiring, it's not obvious anymore.
Right. I mean, they've sort of figured out the area of the brain. I believe it's sort of close to the optic area of the brain, but not wired to it. But there's an area of the brain, right, that is implicated in Cotard's.
Yeah, it looks like from brain scans, one possibility here is that there's a part of the brain called the insular cortex, and just behind the eye, a few inches behind the eye, and that takes in information from across the body, basically integrates all these signals just to sort of have a sense of how the body is doing. And it creates an awareness of the body. And, you could argue that that's what we know, that we're alive thanks to our insular cortex. So you damage that, and all of a sudden people are kind of looking at themselves, and they're like, well, but I don't feel alive anymore, so I must be dead.
All right, we're going to have to pause there. We're going to come back. We're going to have a second segment with Carl. The final segment will be with Ben as we visit with the Zimmer Study. The book is Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive.
What is life?
All right, we're back. We're talking to Carl Zimmer. His new book is Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. We were like having conversations right up to showtime about what we were going to keep and what we were not going to keep, because there's no way you can cover all this stuff. So I decided at the last minute, we're going to throw out some really fascinating stuff that you're just going to have to read about in the book, about that whole question that dogs public policy debates about when human life begins. When is the beginning of human life? And most of the easy, familiar, rote answers that you know are wrong, basically, and it may even be impossible to fully answer that question. And we're also going to throw out we're going to not deal with the question, I think, of when life ends, how you know somebody's life has ended. That's all in the book. It's really, really interesting. We just don't have time for it. So, because Carl, I think I would rather concentrate on two other things. And the first one is this whole question about not when human life begins, but when life began. And there used to be this kind of thought exercise or something that I can't even remember where I encountered it, but it was that idea that a whirlwind flying over a junkyard and somehow or other assembling a 747 was more probable than life coming into existence. That life itself, the idea that life would occur on any particular planet, it was such an incredibly improbable thing. I don't know. Reading your book and learning about liposomes, I find my belief in that model to be ebbing a little bit. It seems like maybe life should happen once in a while.
Yeah, the idea that life was somehow statistically incredibly improbable kind of got its start just from looking at proteins today and looking how big they were and how, particularly well they were kind of put together, and just sort of like, well, how could all of this sort of possibly spontaneously come about? And that was just a very crude, simplistic way of thinking about life, because that's not how evolution works. It's probably not how life began. Life may very well have begun just through kind of a repeated process of chemistry that just took place on Earth or elsewhere, that just lent itself to, over time, producing more and more complex molecules. And then those molecules themselves were able to start reacting in ways that couldn't happen before. And where might this have happened? Well, some people think the right chemistry might have been at the bottom of the ocean, at these vents where hot mineral-rich water is shooting out and creating giant chimneys, where all sorts of weird chemistry is happening today. I mean, you can go to these chimneys and you find bizarre chemicals being formed there right now. Others have argued that ponds on the sides of volcanoes on the early Earth would have been filling up with water and then drying out and filling up with water. And if you run experiments that simulate that in a lab, you can end up with some of the building blocks of life pretty quickly. So life is not looking improbable in the way people claimed it was before.
You might want to mention this guy, David Deamer, who's a fairly large figure in this conversation in your book, and how he thinks that, say, lipids and RNA and stuff like that may be connected to all this, without giving our listeners, more than they can handle.
Well, lipids are basically these sort of oily, greasy molecules. They spontaneously form into bubbles. And we have lipids in our cell walls or cell membranes, and they would have been present on the Earth before life. And so David Deamer, who's for a long time at University of California at Santa Cruz, had this insight of like, well, if life was going to start, you would have to sort of have a place to put life in, because, life isn't just about having genes and metabolism, but like boundaries. We are not just clouds of diffuse molecules. And he had this idea that, in these ponds, maybe these lipids would form these sort of like sandwich-like layers that would compress things like RNA and allow them to go through interesting chemistry and then form into maybe these sort of protocell bubbles. They've done fascinating research over the years. And people might say like, oh, well, what's the point of all this stuff? Well, this kind of research has fascinating side branches, real applications. So, for example, I got a Pfizer vaccine. My Pfizer vaccine is RNA in a lipid bubble. And a lot of the research that people like David Deamer were doing with these big questions of how life began fed into the development of RNA vaccines. And lots of other important applications came out of these basic questions about what life is.
Yeah, actually, I couldn't get that vaccine, so I just lay in a pond at the base of a volcano for about 3 or 4 weeks, and I think I'm probably basically vaccinated at this point.
Well, I wish you the best.
Okay. No, I got the Pfizer too. So, I mean, this also bleeds into the question of, well, first of all, the first question is, as we search for life elsewhere in the universe, one of the reasons that NASA might, for example, have a definition of life, is it likely that we would even necessarily recognize life as it exists elsewhere in the universe? I mean, we tend to talk about DNA and RNA, but as you point out in the book, I mean, there's no particular reason why those particular proteins, the things that we know and have on Earth will be mirrored precisely or even vaguely by something from another planet.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's no clear reason that life has to be like we see it here on Earth. Now, it's possible that DNA and RNA are just really, really good at being genes. Fair enough. But maybe there are other molecules that can do that too. So we have to be open to lots of weird possibilities. And we also have to be kind of modest about, well, when we see something or sense something, like how do we know that it's alive? I mean, like if we went to Mars and you saw a rabbit on Mars, according to the NASA definition, it would have to be capable of Darwinian evolution. Well, if you're just looking at a rabbit there, it's not evolving, it's just a rabbit. But you might suspect that a rabbit on Mars would actually be alive. So maybe we need to sort of come up with better rules for really identifying life. There are actually astrobiologists I've talked to. I said, well, okay, when you get to go to that moon around Saturn and to look for life, what are you looking for? What are the criteria? And talked to one astrobiologist. She said, I'm just looking forward to discovering very weird chemistry. Maybe eventually it'll turn out to be alive or not. That'll be interesting too.
Right. So we should explain about this moon on Saturn, around Saturn. It's called Enceladus. Am I saying that correctly?
Enceladus.
Enceladus. So I was trying to turn it into an Eagles song. Enceladus, when will you? This is a moon where there is stuff going on, and this stuff was noticed by a probe, which in your description kind of went, what? And then they turned it around and said, go back there, probe, go look some more, go look some more, go look 20 times. What is going on in this moon? So what have they found?
Yeah, so the reason that they got so interested in it was because the space probe Cassini was shooting by Enceladus, it's about the size of Arizona, and it's covered in ice, and it goes around Saturn. And as Cassini went by, it turned out that there were these giant plumes that were coming out of the ice, these huge cracks in the ice in the South Pole, and they were. And so Cassini basically turned around and kind of circled Enceladus a few times and basically, scooped up some of that plume. And they found all sorts of stuff. They found carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, benzene, organic compounds of all sorts. And so from that, they're like, okay, something is going on down there. And what they basically determined is that there's a lot of heat at the core of Enceladus generated as it goes around Saturn, and you have these tides. And that heat is driving, maybe these hydrothermal vents, like I was talking about at the bottom of our ocean. And it's creating weird chemistry. And this maybe life is beginning on Enceladus. Maybe it's already begun. It's plausible. And so Lori Barge, an astrobiologist I write about, she would like nothing more than to go back. I mean, she would like to drill into Enceladus and go down in a submarine and see what exactly is going on down there. And I would love to go with her. I mean, who knows what's under that ice? It could be life as we don't know it.
So let's end kind of where we began with, we were talking about Lee Cronin, who had a robot which made something that behaved in a very lifelike way. And that gets us back to something that's, I guess, called assembly theory. And that might be a good way to kind of round out the conversation that we're having. Explain assembly theory and what it has to do with what we're talking about.
So as I was mentioning earlier, we're probably going to be making more progress towards understanding life by coming up with a theory of life rather than trying to define it. And so theories are kind of big overarching explanations that can account for phenomena like life. And physicists come up with theories all the time for superconductivity, all sorts of other things. So maybe there's a theory for life, and scientists are developing various theories right now. We don't know which one is going to win the day, but one of them is a theory that is particularly useful for identifying life. And essentially, what it says is that life can be distinguished from non-life because it's made up of things that are assembled in a lot of steps. So, ordinary chemistry can assemble atoms into more complex molecules, but only up to a point. And it seems that as far as we can tell, molecules above a certain complexity are only produced by living things. There's a certain number of steps beyond which you need life's help. And so it could be that we could just train a telescope at an atmosphere of a planet going around another star and say, oh, look, we can recognize that there is this particularly large chemical compound in the atmosphere. And that, according to assembly theory, had to be produced by life. And then we could say, that star out there, there's life around it.
All right. So I think that is where we'll end. This book is so fascinating. There's so much more in it. I mean, I'm really confident in saying we have just scratched the surface with Carl Zimmer, author of Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Carl Zimmer, of course, writes about science for the New York Times. We're going to take a break. We're going to listen to a little Hans Zimmer. We're going to talk to Ben Zimmer. Who knows how Zimmerly we'll get?
Like a koi in a frozen pond, like a goldfish in a bowl. I don't want to hear you cry.
All right, of course, not of course, but that is the music of Hans Zimmer, who's scored so many famous movies, because we have a very, very Zimmery show today. We've been talking to Carl Zimmer. We're going to talk to Ben Zimmer in just a second. But before we do that, I have to thank a lot of people who for today will be named Zimmer. Kat Zimmer is our technical producer, and she's the one making everything happen, including Hans Zimmer music. And then the person putting it all together is Jonathan McZimmer, who is the producer of this particular episode. Now joining us is Ben Zimmer, linguist, lexicographer, and the language columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He has very recently, anyway, written What a Crossword AI Reveals About Humans' Way with Words. This is an interesting kind of continuation from our previous conversation. Ben Zimmer, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here for the Zimmer Hour.
Yes, it's Super Zimmer Brothers. It's a new video game. We talked about Frankenstein with your brother Carl. Frankenstein, although he might have been an artificial intelligence, was just rubbish at crossword puzzles. I mean, if you gave him the clue fire and it's 3 letters, he'd probably write bad in. But after that, I mean, he's really not going to be able to do too much with this. However, things have advanced quite a bit. So maybe you can begin by just telling us the very significant thing that happened at the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament.
Sure. Well, at the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, which was held virtually this year, usually it's held in Stamford, Connecticut, at the Stamford Marriott. This year it was held online, but there was a competitor that was not human. It was an AI called Dr. Phil, and that's spelled F-I-L-L. And Dr. Phil was first created by a computer scientist named Matt Ginsberg. Matt Ginsberg this year worked with Berkeley Natural Language Group to build this AI that could solve crosswords and do it very quickly. And in fact, this year, Dr. Phil finished first in the scoring. Dr. Phil was an unofficial competitor, so no prizes given to any silicon-based competitors. But Matt Ginsberg has been doing this since 2012. That was the first year that he entered the ACPT with his artificial intelligence, with his crossword-solving AI. It had been gradually getting better, but this year, thanks to that Berkeley group, there were some big improvements that were made, enough for Dr. Phil to outscore all the humans.
We should make the point that Dr. Phil is Phil is kind of a term of art in crossword puzzles. I mean, obviously, you have to fill in a crossword puzzle, but a fill is a specific kind of thing in a crossword puzzle, right?
Yeah, in the crossword world, you talk about a puzzle having, good fill, for instance. Basically, you often have a theme to your crossword puzzle, something that unites generally all the long answers, and then the rest of the entries are called fill because it, fills out the rest of the grid. And so that was just the funny name that Matt Ginsberg gave this AI back in 2012 when he first came up with it. And, he would come to the ACPT in person at the Stanford Marriott and just be sitting in the back of the room in the big ballroom with all the competitors and giving his software the puzzles and seeing how quickly it could solve it. And of course, you have to be accurate if you're in a crossword solving competition. You lose points if you get things wrong, or if you miss certain squares. There are deductions. And so, in fact, this year, even though, on the scoreboard, Dr. Phil, had the highest score, it actually made a few mistakes. Unlike the top human competitors, it didn't solve all the puzzles cleanly. There were 7 puzzles leading up to a championship puzzle. And so despite those 3 mistakes, which gave Dr. Phil some penalties, there was still, it was fast enough, just blazing through these puzzles faster than the humans could, that gave it the edge.
We should say you were in this crossword puzzle tournament too, right? You went up against
right.
Dr. Phil.
Yes, I did compete, and I came in 143rd, which is fine with me. I did make one mistake, so that cost me a little bit. But considering there were more than 1,000 people participating, I'm perfectly happy, where I was, looking up at the ridiculously fast human solvers. Tyler Hinman ended up winning it, and he's won it several times in the past.
We know Tyler.
The other 2 finalists, Eric Agard and David Plotkin, they were able to finish their championship puzzle in about 3 minutes. They each finished this one final puzzle in about 3 minutes. If you watch them solve it, it's ridiculous. It's like their machines just plowing through these crossword puzzles. But on that championship puzzle, Dr. Phil was able to solve that one cleanly in 49 seconds.
So we should talk a little bit about what Dr. Phil does that we don't do, and what we do that he doesn't, or it doesn't do. I mean, for example, one of the clues, I am rubbish at crossword puzzles. I just want to say that right up front. But one of the clues was a pretty obvious one. Poet who wrote "Jellicle cats are merry and bright." Well, I would have gotten that. I know that it's T.S. Eliot, and I don't have to think about it too much either. It's just sort of the stupid musical, all that stuff. In fact, I think "cats" was the answer to the real New York Times crossword puzzle clue like 2 days ago. But Dr. Phil, I don't know. I mean, it has to do something different, and that I think involves eliminating wrong answers before getting to the right one.
Yeah, basically. So if Dr. Phil sees a clue like that, right off the bat, Dr. Phil can recognize we need a name for a poet. Now, there is an enormous database of past clues, of millions of clues and answers that have been used in the New York Times puzzle and other major crosswords that Matt Ginsberg has put together over the years. And so Dr. Phil can go back and check and see, was this clue used in the past or something similar at least? And it just so happens that Eliot hasn't been clued quite that way, referring to jellicle cats, I guess. And because Dr. Phil can't just Google the answers, it's a closed system. It has to just rely on, basically whatever information it can glean from the clue itself without going and, just like we'd be able to just check Google to see, jellicle cats, right? That was T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
So it knew that it had a 5-letter name for a poet, but there are, other 5-letter poets like Keats and Yeats and Blake and so forth. So it generates a list of candidates, and then it basically assigns a weight or a value to each one of them about how likely that seems to be the right answer. And it's similar to other AI systems. If we remember, for instance, Watson from IBM that competed on Jeopardy 10 years ago and beat the humans like Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. It was also generating lots of candidates for what the answer to a Jeopardy question might be. In this case, with the crossword, it's a bit of a different task because you know how many letters it is, and you also get information from the crossing entries. So if this wasn't a cross entry, as you're filling in the puzzle, you might know, based on these crossing entries, I know, I have a good sense of what the letters might be. So that will narrow down the candidates. And so even though Dr. Phil didn't know right off the bat that this was T.S. Eliot, it thought, well, maybe Keats or Yeats would be a better answer here for the poet that we're looking for. Based on all this other context with how we solve the puzzle by looking at how squares might share in a cross and down entry, it was able to zero in on Eliot.
So we only got about 3 minutes left, and I want to deal with one other thing. There's something different from Jeopardy and certainly different from chess about crossword puzzles. There's a profoundly human element in there, and people who do crossword puzzles spend a lot of time being pissed off at crossword puzzle constructors, because they've come up with these kind of annoying clues. If you read Rex Parker's analysis in the New York Times Daily Crossword Puzzle, you see this all the time. So there's a clue 2 or 3 days ago. It's 39A, recurring pain, ? So question mark always means this isn't really a logical answer. And the answer was imp, which is like this incredible stretch. It's like somebody who needs IMP as a fill and is gonna, instead of like a clue that you could maybe suss out, is making a little joke and either you get it from the other stuff around it or you don't. I mean, how does Dr. Phil deal with that? Because that is not really there's no real easy path from recurring pain ? To imp.
Exactly. Yeah, those tricky clues that are tricky for humans are even trickier for Dr. Phil. And so, yeah, it has trouble making those leaps of logic, basically. But of course, that's what makes crossword solving so interesting, is that you can get these forms of wordplay. They may involve puns, various kinds of lateral thinking. And, humans can do that with some effort. But to have an AI be able to do that is really challenging. And so you mentioned like the question mark at the end of a clue, which tells the solver something funny is going on here. It could be a pun or something like that. Well, there was a clue like that at the ACPT, and the clue was substandard. And so actually using this neural network system that the Berkeley group developed, that Dr. Phil was able to think about this, if you want to say think about it, but by looking at that question mark, and because of this neural net, it knows basically that means something that might not be the standard definition is being used here. But it went in a completely wrong direction. It came up with candidates like tuna on rye because it figured that a sub had to do with a sandwich,
which a human being might have gone there too,
Sure, yeah, absolutely. As you're kind of going through what could this mean if it's something a little indirect. The actual answer was periscope is a substandard. So eventually Dr. Phil could get there too, but that's an example of the way that we use language in very creative ways. The people who make the puzzles and solve the puzzles are relying on a kind of human creativity that is very difficult for an AI to mimic.
And very human.
So there's still lots to do in this area, basically, in terms of being able to tackle that sort of thing.
Ben Zimmer, we've got to stop there. Ben Zimmer, linguist and lexicographer and language columnist for the Wall Street Journal. We love having him on our show. We've had him lots of times before. We're going to have him lots of times in the future. I just want to say I used to live in this building that was sort of full of people the kind of people who did crossword puzzles. And I got on an elevator one day, and these two people just said to one another, one said to the other, "I am out of communion with Will Shortz." You know, that's the kind of human reaction to crossword puzzle constructors. All right, we have to stop there.